Are you okay?
I'm okay.
I'm ready to cry.
You know I can't get out of my head.
I know. Listen.
It just doesn't stop.
Jazz Jennings, a name that, for years, resonated as a beacon of progress, a symbol of courage and authenticity in the unfolding conversation around gender identity. From captivating interviews to her own reality television series, she was presented as the face of a new era, a testament to affirmation and acceptance. Yet, behind the carefully curated spotlight, a more complex, and at times, disquieting truth began to emerge. What unfolds when the immense weight of a societal movement rests upon the slender shoulders of a child, long before they've even had the chance to truly discover who they are? This is not just the story of what we saw, but perhaps more importantly, what we failed to fully grasp, the journey of America's youngest public transition, and the profound questions it raises about childhood, identity, and the relentless demands of public representation. It began, as many profound stories do, with what appeared to be a simple, innocent truth. Born in 2000 in South Florida, assigned male at birth, Jazz Jennings began articulating her gender identity with striking clarity as early as age 2. "I'm not a boy," she would insist. "I'm a girl. I am definitely a girl. That's all I consider myself as." Her parents, Greg and Jeanette, initially considered it a phase, but Jazz's conviction intensified, marked by inconsolable tears at the prospect of boys' clothes or male pronouns. Faced with a decision few parents at the time could fathom, they chose to affirm her stated identity. By age 5, Jazz's social transition was complete. She lived as a girl, dressed as a girl, and was known by her chosen name. What started as a deeply personal family choice, however, was about to become a public spectacle. In 2007, a 6-year-old Jazz appeared on ABC's 2020 with Barbara Walters, catapulting her into an unprecedented global spotlight as one of the youngest and most visible transgender individuals. The segment was undeniably groundbreaking. A nation watched, captivated and confused, as a seemingly confident child articulated her identity with a clarity that seemed to defy her years. Walters herself appeared visibly stunned. The public reaction was polarized. Some lauded the Jennings family for their open-mindedness, others voiced concern, accusing them of prematurely labeling their child. That televised moment, Jazz's bright, innocent eyes gazing out from national television screens, ignited a firestorm. She was no longer just a child. She had become a cultural icon, a lightning rod in an increasingly fervent global debate about gender, identity, childhood, and the burgeoning medical interventions. But beneath this public narrative, something far more intricate and, arguably, problematic was unfolding. Jazz's story wasn't solely about authenticity, it became entangled with issues of control, narrative construction, and the suffocating weight of being a movement's primary representative. Jeanette Jennings, Jazz's mother, emerged as a dominant force in her daughter's life. Fiercely protective, deeply immersed, she seemed intent on not just charting a path for Jazz, but for all trans children. She became the de facto spokesperson for trans youth parenting, meticulously arranging interviews, coordinating appearances, and later, overseeing the production of I Am Jazz, the TLC reality series that would chronicle Jazz's adolescence. But a crucial question lingers. Was this unwavering support, or was it, at times, an active orchestration of her daughter's life for a broader agenda? From that point forward, Jazz's existence became inextricably linked to the media machine. Reality TV cameras followed her everywhere, to school, doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, even into moments that should have remained private reflections. She penned a children's book, embarked on speaking tours, and became a figurehead for thousands. Yet, even in those early days, subtle signs of internal tension, an emotional burden growing heavier with each passing year, were perceptible. Jazz wasn't merely living her truth, she was performing it, on cue, for millions. As Jazz approached puberty, her family made another monumental and controversial decision. At age 11, under medical supervision, Jazz began taking puberty blockers. These medications are designed to suppress the natural onset of puberty, preventing the development of secondary sex characteristics that align with one's natal sex. In Jazz's case, facial hair, voice deepening, or genital growth. Her physicians and family presented it as a medical necessity, a preventative measure against the potential trauma of undergoing a puberty that conflicted with her affirmed identity. For many, Within the medical and activist communities, this was hailed as a progressive, affirming leap forward, yet, for others, it sparked questions that resonate with increasing intensity today. Was jazz truly old enough to provide informed consent for such a profoundly impactful and, at the time, largely uncharted medical intervention? Could a child genuinely grasp the long-term consequences of halting natural development, consequences that were, even then, not fully understood? The blockers were subsequently followed by cross-sex hormones, specifically estrogen, to feminize her body. By 14, her voice remained high, her frame slight, her physical development aligning with that of a cisgender girl. On the surface, she projected an image of confidence and contentment. But beneath that exterior, insidious doubts began to surface. In private moments, Jazz began recording raw, unfiltered diary entries in video journals. In one particularly unsettling instance, aired on I Am Jazz, she made a confession that sent shivers down the spines of many viewers. I feel like I'm living a lie. I don't feel like me. That admission rang alarm bells far beyond her immediate circle. For years, Jazz had been meticulously presented as the quintessential trans youth success story, happy, healthy, and unequivocally thriving, yet, here she was, alone, visibly confused, questioning her very sense of self. The unease was no longer merely emotional, it was existential. Psychologists have long debated the multifaceted effects of blocking puberty, not just on physical development, but on mental and emotional maturation. Puberty isn't solely a hormonal process, it's a critical period for identity formation, cognitive growth, and the development of emotional regulation. By effectively bypassing this natural, tumultuous, yet formative process, had Jazz inadvertently lost something intangible, something crucial to self-discovery. Critics began to suggest that by freezing Jazz's physical development, adults had also, perhaps unintentionally, stifled her capacity for natural self-questioning or organic evolution. She had never known what it felt like to mature naturally, to navigate the complexities of identity alongside her peers without constant public scrutiny, or to explore her emerging self in the privacy afforded to most adolescents. Every single step of her self-discovery had been meticulously shaped, exhaustively documented, and enthusiastically applauded in the public sphere. As puberty blockers became a more widespread topic in the political landscape, Jazz's experience was increasingly invoked as a case study. To proponents, her story was validation; for early intervention. To opponents, it transformed into a sobering cautionary tale. And for Jazz herself, the crushing burden of expectation, of perpetually being the right kind of trans person, of always smiling, always advocating, always projecting an image of unwavering certainty, was slowly, inexorably, becoming unbearable. Her private diary entries weren't just cries for help, they were stark, unheeded warning signs. This wasn't liberation, this was a life increasingly disconnected from her own burgeoning sense of self. By the time Jazz Jennings turned 17, her journey had been extensively dissected in academic circles, medical seminars, and trans advocacy forums. It was hailed, praised, and held up as a model, yet, beneath the layers of accolades, a complicated medical reality was beginning to surface, one that even her own physicians hadn't fully foreseen. In 2018, Jazz underwent gender confirmation surgery, a procedure intended to construct a neovagina. It was presented as a pivotal milestone, not only for Jazz personally but for the broader transgender youth movement. At the time, she was among the youngest individuals in the United States to undergo this irreversible operation. However, the celebratory tone quickly dissipated. On I Am Jazz, her doctors were jarringly candid. Because Jazz had been on puberty blockers from such a precocious age, she hadn't developed sufficient penile tissue to use in constructing the vaginal canal, an unforeseen anatomical consequence directly linked to the very medical path her early transition had relied upon. As a result, surgeons were forced to improvise, utilizing skin grafts from her stomach to compensate for the significant lack of material. It was a delicate, high-risk endeavor. Complications arose within days. Jazz developed severe inflammation, intense pain, and significant issues with healing. The initial surgery, far from being a singular, definitive event, became the grim beginning of a grueling medical saga. She underwent multiple follow-up surgeries to correct structural problems and battle persistent infections. Each subsequent procedure compounded the already immense physical and emotional toll. "I've had a lot of surgeries," Jazz later recounted in an interview. "And I've had a lot of complications. But it was the quiet moments, those captured off-stage or in raw confessional scenes, that truly revealed the deeper, more insidious damage." Jazz, once renowned for her infectious optimism, began to visibly fracture under the crushing weight of her experience. She spoke of feeling disassociated, numb, and profoundly unlike herself. "I feel kind of broken," she admitted, a statement that resonated far beyond the screen. It forced both fervent supporters and staunch critics alike to re-examine a hard, uncomfortable truth, that gender-affirming surgery, while genuinely life-saving for some, can carry profound and unforeseen risks, particularly when pursued at a young age, under the unblinking eye of cameras, and with limited long-term research to guide the process. What was intended to be the symbolic culmination of Jazz's journey, her ultimate affirmation, instead became the unsettling start of a darker, more painful chapter, physically scarred, emotionally depleted, and now grappling with the harsh realities of a body painstakingly rebuilt under immense public pressure. Jazz was no longer just a pioneer, she was a patient, recovering not only from multiple complex surgeries but from the crushing expectations of a world that had, perhaps unwittingly, made her its poster child. That in the aftermath of her surgeries, Jazz Jennings slowly, then abruptly, retreated from the relentless glare of the spotlight. Her social media activity dwindled, her public appearances became scarce. When she eventually resurfaced, she was undeniably different, heavier, quieter, more visibly guarded. The vibrant, bright-eyed child who had once inspired millions had entered a private, arduous battle with profound mental illness. By her early 20s, Jazz bravely revealed she had gained over 100 pounds, what began as a period of post-surgical healing morphed into destructive episodes of binge eating, consuming entire pizzas, multiple boxes of donuts, or thousands of calories in a single, desperate sitting. The dramatic weight gain was both a devastating symptom and a stark signal: something was profoundly wrong. "I'm spiraling," she confessed on her show. "Food is my coping mechanism." The physical changes were inextricably linked to severe emotional ones. Crippling depression crept in, compounded by overwhelming anxiety. She frequently struggled to get out of bed. Even basic tasks like brushing her teeth or attending therapy sessions felt insurmountable, despite the unwavering support from her parents, especially her mother, Jeanette. Jazz appeared utterly lost. In one particularly harrowing scene from I Am Jazz, Jeanette confronts her daughter during a moment of profound despair. Her voice rising, her face flushed with fatigue and desperation, Jeanette pleaded, "You're just saying stuff and it doesn't make sense. I just want you to love yourself. Why is that so hard?" Jazz, her eyes blank and heavy with sadness, offered no response. The audience witnessed a mother's desperate attempt to pull her daughter back from the brink, and a daughter seemingly beyond reach. The raw emotional intensity of that moment stood in stark contrast to the early episodes of the show, where Jazz had seemed almost untouchable, wise beyond her years, endlessly resilient, an unblemished success story. Then came the academic detour. Jazz had been accepted into Harvard University, an extraordinary achievement for any student, but particularly for someone who had navigated life under such relentless scrutiny. Yet, instead of heading straight to Cambridge, Jazz made the surprising decision to delay her enrollment. Her reason, delivered with a quiet resignation: "I need time to heal." The decision shocked fans and commentators alike. For years, Jazz had been presented as a living embodiment of progress and potential, a vibrant example of what it meant to thrive as a trans youth. Now, she was stepping back, openly admitting that she was not okay, and in doing so, she inadvertently shattered the meticulously crafted illusion that her transition had been an easy, linear, or fully complete journey. This was no longer the triumphant narrative of a trailblazer breaking barriers. It was the raw, painful story of a young woman isolated by fame, consumed by depression, and fighting desperately to reclaim control of a life that, for so long, had never truly been hers to shape. As the years passed and Jazz Jennings's once radiant smile dimmed under layers of emotional fatigue, the question that few dared to voice during her meteoric rise began to echo with increasing volume: was it all simply too much, too soon? Even ardent supporters of early gender affirmation found themselves pausing, forced to reflect. Jazz's story, once the bedrock for medical policies, TED Talks, and school guidelines, now revealed troubling fissures beneath its polished surface. Could a child, at the tender ages of 2, 5, or even 11, genuinely comprehend the profound, lifelong medical, psychological, and social implications of a transition that would fundamentally alter not just their body, but their very sense of self? This uncomfortable line of questioning became almost impossible to ignore, particularly after a provocative 2023 article in Spiked Online boldly titled "The Tragedy of Jazz Jennings." The piece minced no words that it levied a stark accusation, that the adults in Jazz's life, parents, medical professionals, and influential media figures, had effectively outsourced her intrinsic well-being to a larger social cause. That it argued that Jazz had become a symbol first, a person second. Someone inadvertently trapped within a well-meaning yet relentlessly affirming narrative that seemingly left no room for hesitation, ambiguity, or natural exploration. Critics questioned whether Jazz had been subtly robbed of crucial psychological development, the quiet intimacy of understanding her own changing emotions, and perhaps most tragically, the fundamental right to say, "I'm not sure." On her own show, Jazz expressed unsettling truths that were often overshadowed by upbeat editing or chirpy soundtracks. That in one particularly jarring scene, Jazz confesses, her voice monotone, her expression blank, "I don't experience sexual attraction to anyone that I don't know if I ever will." In that raw moment, the image of a thriving, self-assured young woman faded into that of a confused, possibly traumatized adolescent, adrift in uncertainty about her body, her desires, and even her future as a romantic being. The media had meticulously documented her transition step by step, yet few had paused to ask the crucial why at each juncture. Why were hormone blockers introduced so early? Why was irreversible surgery scheduled before adulthood? Why had virtually no one on public record questioned the potential psychological trade-offs? These were not attacks on trans identity itself, they were, instead, trenchant critiques of a system, social, medical, and cultural, that had arguably treated Jazz as an ideological prototype rather than a living, breathing, evolving child. As more complex outcomes and even stories of regret began to surface from other individuals who underwent early transitions, Jazz's story started to appear not as a unique anomaly, but as an emblematic cautionary tale. The dominant affirming narrative, it seemed, had made no discernible room for discomfort. No space for the inevitable growing pains of adolescence, no allowance for the simple human need to say, wait. And that glaring omission, many now argue, may have cost Jazz her hard-won peace. At the zenith of her public visibility, Jazz Jennings was far more than just a name. She was a banner, a radiant, articulate teenager who commanded her own reality show, penned best-selling books, spoke at prestigious universities, and even inspired legislative debates. She embodied everything that trans advocacy groups could hope for: intelligent, sweet-natured, non-threatening, impeccably media-trained, a meticulously crafted mascot for progress. But a pedestal, however high, is rarely a safe place to stand up. By her early 20s, that carefully cultivated image began its undeniable unraveling. Slowly, then with an unsettling suddenness, Jazz was no longer the unshakable symbol of trans success. She was openly grappling with debilitating depression, compulsive binge eating, profound self-doubt, and the lingering trauma of multiple surgeries. And as she struggled, so too did the very movement that had leaned so heavily, so uncritically, on her singular story. Activists found themselves facing an uncomfortable dilemma: how to frame Jazz's public struggles in a world hungry for simplistic narratives. Some advocates doubled down, insisting that Jazz's evident pain was not a failure of gender transition itself, but rather a tragic consequence of a world still riddled with transphobia. If anything, they argued, her difficulties only served to underscore the urgent need for more resources, more societal support, more mainstream visibility. Jazz, they maintained, was a pioneer wounded not by her chosen path, but by the undeniable cruelty of society. Others within the LGBTQ+ community opted for a quieter, more subtle route. Some organizations, once eager to feature Jazz's story prominently in their brochures or school curricula, began to subtly distance themselves. She no longer fit the neatly packaged archetype of the happy trans teen becomes happy trans adult. Her tears, her weight gain, her isolation, these were inconvenient truths in a cultural climate still fighting tooth and nail to prove that transition invariably leads to wholeness and well-being. And through it all, the political arena watched, poised to exploit. Conservative commentators seized on Jazz's visible pain as potent ammunition in their arguments against gender-affirming care for minors. Clips from I Am Jazz were recirculated, often taken out of context. Headlines screamed, "Look what they did to her." To them, Jazz was no longer a case study in hope, but a stark example of ideological overreach. She became a tragic prop in relentless culture war debates, her own voice often muted as both sides screamed over her image, desperate to mold her into their preferred narrative. Jazz herself had grown increasingly weary of this relentless public dissection. In private moments, she expressed profound exhaustion, not just from her personal struggles, but from the crushing burden of being a symbol at all. "I just want to be me," she once said softly. "Not someone people debate about." But after nearly 2 decades in the unforgiving spotlight, Jazz's identity was no longer solely her own. It belonged to academic panels, classroom discussions, state legislative houses, and venomous internet forums. She had been assigned a new, unforeseen kind of gender representative, a role no child should ever be forced to carry, and now, having endured the procedures, the applause, the trauma, and the backlash, the haunting question remains: who, truly, is Jazz Jennings when the cameras finally turn off and the public gaze moves on? For many years, the Jennings family was presented as a unified, unbreakable front, staunch allies navigating a hostile world for the sake of their transgender daughter. Their home was depicted as a sanctuary of affirmation, a busy hub of medical planning, TV production meetings, and constant press interviews. To the outside world, they appeared to be the quintessential model of unconditional love and progressive parenting. But the fissures were always there, they simply weren't shown in the carefully curated highlight reels. Jeanette Jennings, Jazz's mother, had consistently been the family's loudest, most relentless voice. From the very beginning, she acted as the gatekeeper, coordinating hormone treatments, advocating passionately for surgery, and fiercely defending Jazz's choices, and her own. To online skeptics and on national television. In interviews, she portrayed herself as a warrior mother, protective, passionate, and utterly uncompromising. However, as Jazz's emotional and physical struggles intensified, so too did Jeanette's visible frustration. The outwardly supportive tone began to fray, revealing raw nerves. In later seasons of I Am Jazz, viewers were privy to jarringly candid moments. In one memorable scene, Jeanette sits across from her daughter in the kitchen, her voice rising, her face flushed with evident fatigue and exasperation. "I've been through this with you too long," she exclaimed. "You're just making excuses." Jazz, blank-eyed and heavy with sadness, offered no response. This wasn't merely a family spat, it was a potent symbol of something far deeper, the invisible, often painful tension between genuine love and an overwhelming desire for control, between protection and unconscious projection. The dynamic between mother and daughter had irrevocably shifted. Jeanette had long carried the banner of trans advocacy, but now, critics began to openly ask, was it truly about Jazz's well-being, or about preserving a public story they had all committed so deeply to telling? Even initial supporters found themselves wrestling with uncomfortable questions. Had Jeanette, in her commendable urgency to protect and promote, inadvertently failed to pause and truly hear her daughter's escalating pain? Had Jazz been swept up in a powerful tide of affirmation so overwhelming that even her own parents couldn't see when she desperately needed to stop, to breathe, to simply be? A growing chorus of voices online began to accuse Jeanette of overreach. Some labeled her the stage mom of a movement, a woman so deeply embedded in the narrative of progress that she seemed unable to let go, even as her daughter quietly, tragically, unraveled. Every meltdown, every therapy session, every awkward, vulnerable confession was aired on national television, meticulously packaged for mass consumption, fueling the very narrative that now seemed to be consuming Jazz. Meanwhile, other family members displayed clear signs of exhaustion and concern. Jazz's siblings expressed their worries in hushed, almost hesitant tones. Her father, Greg, once a calming counterweight to Jeanette's fierce intensity, appeared increasingly withdrawn and checked out in later episodes, quietly observing instead of actively intervening. The emotional center of the family had fractured, and no one seemed quite sure where to stand anymore. The public had once viewed the Jennings as a shining symbol of hope. Now, they increasingly looked like what they truly were, a family caught in the relentless, unforgiving machinery of advocacy, media, and irreversible medical decisions. A family desperately trying to support their daughter while grappling with the unforeseen, painful consequences of transforming her into a national icon, and the most poignant question lingered like a haunting ghost. Had Jazz truly been allowed to grow into herself organically, authentically? Or had she been fast-tracked, even rushed, because the world needed a specific story more than it needed her to be genuinely whole? To simply label Jazz Jennings' story as tragic would be an oversimplification. It is, more accurately, a profound reflection of the impossible burden placed upon a child, tasked not just with navigating her own identity, but with representing an entire societal movement. From the tender age of 6, Jazz was framed as a hero, a revolutionary, a preordained success story. She became the very first public face of a national conversation on trans youth at a time when society, grappling with new concepts, was desperate for a relatable, articulate poster child. In many ways, she seemed to fit the part perfectly, but true identity is never meant to be built for an audience. By her early 20s, that harsh truth came crashing down. Despite her consistent insistence that she still identifies as female and remains a supporter of trans youth, Jazz began to speak with a painful, unvarnished honesty about the hidden costs of her journey. She openly admitted to feeling emotionally lost, sexually disconnected, and psychologically depleted. She wasn't just dealing with the physical aftermath of multiple complex surgeries, she was grappling with the profound consequences of never having the genuine chance to wonder who she might have become without the constant presence of cameras, the rigid scripts of public appearances, and the relentless pressure to embody an ideal. In one particularly poignant scene from her show, she said quietly, almost to herself, "I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore." That single sentence should have reverberated across the nation, silencing debates. It wasn't a statement about being transgender, it was a deeply human cry, one that starkly exposed the emotional vacuum created when identity is meticulously shaped under unrelenting scrutiny. Jazz's story reveals that even the most well-intentioned narratives, when amplified and rigidified, can become gilded cages. In our collective rush to celebrate perceived progress, we sometimes overlook the messy, nuanced complexity of individual lives. Jazz's tale is not, fundamentally, a warning against gender transition itself. Instead, it serves as a potent warning against premature certainty, against the overmedicalization of childhood, and crucially, against the dangerous weaponization of young lives for political or ideological gain. She was lauded when she smiled, when she articulated the right things, when she made it all look effortless and easy, but when she began to falter, to visibly backslide, to gain weight, to openly admit confusion and pain, suddenly her story became inconvenient, a narrative liability, and yet, paradoxically, that is precisely when she became profoundly real. What Jazz's journey truly exposes is a broader cultural failing, our collective discomfort with complexity and ambiguity. We crave clean, linear stories that we celebrate triumphant, before and after, transformations, but Jazz remains stuck in the murky, painful middle, a place where growth, regret, acceptance, and profound doubt all coexist simultaneously. She is no longer just a symbol, she is, at her core, a young woman struggling, fighting desperately to rebuild herself after a childhood lived under unrelenting public pressure, a person navigating the most intimate questions of identity in real time, in public, and in pain. And in that raw, painful authenticity, perhaps there lies a new kind of hope, not the glossy, sanitized kind, but the hope born from brutal honesty, from saying, "I don't have all the answers." From admitting, "I'm still figuring it out." As of 2024, Jazz Jennings continues to post updates online, openly discussing her ongoing battles with mental health, and engaging with the dedicated fanbase who have followed her since early childhood. She is actively working on her physical health, striving to lose weight, and diligently rebuilding her confidence, seeking a clearer path for her future, but there is a palpable quietness now. The reality TV cameras have largely faded, the intense political spotlight, for the most part, has shifted. For perhaps the very first time in her life, Jazz is not overtly functioning as a symbol, not merely a headline, not an ambassador for a cause. She is, simply, a young woman striving to figure out what it truly means to be herself, away from the relentless public gaze. And in that quiet, a haunting question lingers, echoing long after the final credits roll: What truly happens when a child is transformed into a movement before they've even had the chance to fully learn how to simply be a person? What are your thoughts on this reinterpretation of Jazz's story? Does it align with the kind of critical yet nuanced perspective you were aiming for?